Hey there, Think Twice fans. This is Alan. I'm back again. I'm talking a little bit more Yawgmoth. We've had some success with our some of the Yawgmoth content that I've put out in terms of deck techs and things of that nature. So I figure if that is a thing that seems to be getting some traction, then I'm not gonna fight it and I'm just gonna run with it. So what I'm gonna do today is this isn't gonna be like the full length deck tech like I've done in the past, because a lot of that is still the same stuff. I'll briefly touch on a few of like the combo loops and things like that just to kind of reiterate it, but mostly I'm just gonna be talking about where my list currently is for Yawgmoth and kind of why I'm making some of the decisions I am. So that's mainly what we're going to be doing. So here we go. Okay, so starting off, just running through the land count. And if you want the deck list, this deck list is linked to the Mox field list in the description of the video, so you can always see it. I know sometimes it's not always the easiest to parse through all the cards on a video. Mana base, there's nothing super special. You'll find, some number of forests, number of fetch lands. I've got 6 fetches. They're all green, so you got 4 verdant catacombs, and then just whatever other green fetch you have, I think is fine. I have Misty Rainforest, so I run those. I've almost always been on a 2 forest, 1 swamp mix. You've got some overgrown tombs. You've got some underground mortuaries. I run a couple. Excuse me, sorry. I run a couple of Wastewood Verge. Those are your sets of duels. And then you've got, I've got 6 basically utility lands that I can run through here really quickly. And none of it's going to be a surprise. There's one addition that was not in the list, I think, back when I did my 2025 deck tech, which was probably like springtime 2025. You're obviously going to have Dryad Arbor because Green Sun Zenith got unbanned, and so ever since then you're running one of those. You got some number of Boseiju. I run 2. You can run 3 if you want. Shifting Woodland. I find that I almost never use Shifting Woodland. I almost never activate this to make a copy of something, but I feel like it's a very small cost to include one of these, and sometimes it works out. And then the new one is I'm running 2 copies of Spymaster's Vault. Spymaster's Vault doesn't really change any of your combo ability in the deck, but I think what it does is it gives you an out when the games end up being more fair. Sorry again. All of a sudden I have a tickle in my throat. So when the games end up being more fair, this gives you a way just to kind of move through some bad draws or make those situations where you're attacking with a couple of small creatures. You make one creature into a little bit of a bigger dude, and it's oh, this is kind of formidable now. I find it also comes up on turns when you're able to do a little bit of Yawgmoth sacrificing, but then but they kill the Yawgmoth, so you can't keep on going. And you're oh, I've had 3 or 4 creatures die. I can now draw 4 cards and make my hand way better. So Spymaster's Vault is a thing there that I think is a worthy inclusion. That's 21 lands total. That includes the Dryad Arbor. You'll see a lot of lists run 22. You can play with that as you want. I don't want to spend much time on the mana base. I think it's fairly simple. You've got a package of fetch lands, mana producing lands, and then your kind of very common suite of utility lands that also kind of have regular land function. I think one of the nice things about this mana base is, despite the fact that you have so many non-basic lands, almost all of your lands easily come in untapped. The only 2 obviously being the Underground Mortuary, because it can only come in tapped, but your hope is that you're fetching for this when you want it, so you can get the Surveil, where everything else is an untapped land most of the time, because the Shifting Woodland and the Spymaster's Vault, you just have to have one of your duels in play, And these just always come in untapped. Boseiju comes in untapped. Like, Wastewood Verge comes in untapped. So it is very rare that you're like, shoot, I drew a tapped land in this deck. And that is one thing I really enjoy about this mana base. But we're going to move on to more interesting things. I believe when I made the deck tech video that you may have seen on the channel, if not, I think it's worth checking out. I go through all of the interactions of the cards in the deck and like how to do a lot of the combo loops. So if you're new to the deck or anything, that is a great video to check out. I'll see if I remember to put a link to that one in the description as well. One of the things that I was working through, and I think the Yawgmoth community in general is working through, was a decision between Malevolent Rumble, right here, and a card that came out in Aether Drift called, I'm just blanking on it right now, Dredger's Insight, which does the same thing as Rumble does in some ways, where it's going to, you're going to fuel the graveyard, you're going to look at 4, you get to put some type of permanent from your hand, from that into your hand, the rest go into the graveyard. And Dredger's Insight then said, like, whenever a creature or an artifact leaves your graveyard, you gain a life. So what it allowed you to do is when you were looping with Yawgmoth, it allowed you to offset the life cost of the Yawgmoth ability. So you could, it was another way to do this endlessly that we still have in other ways, and you've had for a while with Prosperous Innkeeper, things like that. And there was a question of, do you play Dredger's Insight instead of Malevolent Rumble? Do you play some combination of both? And I tried out some versions that had 6, 7, sometimes 8 copies between the two of those. And I think what I've really settled on, and I think you're going to find starting to become a consensus, is that Rumble is just the better card. It looks at the same number. It has no restriction on permanent type. Even though I never ran into an issue with Dredger's Insight not being able to grab the permanent I wanted, it couldn't grab another copy of Dredger's Insight, for instance. But I don't think there's anything that the deck currently plays that Insight couldn't grab that like Rumble can. But you don't have that exception. But the by far biggest difference is that when Malevolent Rumble resolves, it gives you a body. And that body is not only good for being able to sacrifice Yawgmoth, it also creates more mana. So it makes Rumble really a 1-mana card, not a 2-mana card. And I think that is really a powerful thing you can do with this deck, is you can string a lot of plays together, because a lot of your cards that look like 2-mana are actually 1-mana. And so they give you that rebate, so you can either bank extra mana for the next turn, and so you can easily go from 3 to like 6, 7 mana on the next turn with this deck, or it allows you to just put multiple spells together. You're often able to play 4 mana worth of stuff on turn 2 with this deck. So I think that makes Rumble, just to me, the clear winner, and this is the card you should be playing. Dredger's Insight doesn't give us anything we didn't already have the capability of doing. It is not a unique effect of the gaining the life to offset the Yawgmoth ability, so I don't think that's worth playing, in my opinion. I don't think it's a wrong decision if you want to play some number of Dredger's Insight, but I think you should definitely start with 4 Rumble, and if you want to put some of your few flex slots into Dredger's Insight instead of some of these other cards, then that's fine. But the body and the mana reduction that essentially gives you with Rumble is just paramount, I think, in making this card a better choice. Along those same veins, your other 2 drops that give you a mana back are Wall of Roots and Prosperous Innkeeper. Prosperous Innkeeper via Treasure, Wall of Roots via its ability to add a -0, -1 counter and add a green mana. There are, in that same time, when Dredger's Insight was being considered, Wall of Roots saw a large reduction in play from the list that I noticed. And it was just because, like, you had to cut something somewhere, and you can only cut so many things, because you need some of these things to be able to impact the board or, I don't know, win the game. So Wall of Roots got cut. I am so glad to have Wall of Roots back in numbers, because this card has always been impressive to me. And especially when you run some number of Chord of Calling, Wall of Roots is huge. So we can do that. We can work through that sort of stuff. So these 8 cards, these 8 2-drops, give you mana back on the same turn that you cast them, and I think that's huge. And so they're really powerful, really good. You can also use Wall of Roots in combination with Yawgmoth, a Walking Ballista, and an Agatha's Soul Cauldron in order to combo off. If you have both of these, if you don't know how that works, if you have both Walking Ballista and Wall of Roots under your Soul Cauldron and you put a counter on your Yawgmoth, what you are able to do is you use the Wall of Roots ability to add your -0, -1 counter, which will represent with blue dice usually. So then you float a green mana. So now your Yawgmoth is a 2/1. And the key thing to remember is that this is not a -1, -1 counter, because the rules of Magic say that if you have a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter on the same permanent, they just cancel out and they would disappear. So that would mean that you couldn't activate any more abilities, which is the key point here. So you have a 2/1 Yawgmoth with a single +1/+1 counter on it. So what you're able to do then is you're able to activate Walking Ballista's ability, remove a +1/+1 counter, deal a damage. So you target your opponent with the Walking Ballista ability. When you remove this counter to deal the damage, Yawgmoth is now a 1/1 with a single -0, -1 counter on it. The game sees a 1/0 creature, it dies, it no longer has a +1/+1 counter on it, so it comes back. So you're able to do that loop over and over again. And you add a green mana and deal a damage every time, and you can just do that as many times as you want. And so there you're able to win, and Wall of Roots is a huge part of that. What you saw a lot of people playing with Dredger's Insight is you'd have Dredger's Insight in this place, and that would just be infinite life, because you would just have the Yawgmoth ping itself, and then it'd come back, and you'd gain a life from the Dredger's Insight, seeing a card leave your graveyard. But I think the ability to outright win the game is more powerful than basically win the game, because infinite life doesn't actually end the game. It just makes it so that your opponent is probably like, okay, I mostly can't beat that. But there are some decks that can. So that's a great inclusion there. So some of the other card choices you'll see that I've made, one of the big ones is your card choice in terms of tutors. So I am right now on a split of 3 Green Sun, 3 Chord. I've been at different points 4 Green Sun, 1 Chord, 4 Green Sun, 2 Chord, 4 Green Sun. I've seen 4 Green Sun lists no Chord of Calling. I really think Chord adds an extra element to this deck, especially since Green Sun Zenith cannot grab 2 important pieces of this build, and that is obviously Yawgmoth and Namesake, and a new card we're going to be talking about here, Sephiroth Fabled Soldier. Okay. So, Chord of Calling is really important. You can also do some cool things with Chord of Calling where you can chord for X is 0 to grab a Walking Ballista to put into your graveyard to do some of the things I talked about with Walking Ballista and Yawgmoth. I also have been including a Haywire Might in my main deck. Now, normally I've strayed away from Haywire Might because you can't find it with Green Sun, but when you go up to 3 Chord of Calling, finding a 1 mana way to interact with a lot of problematic permanents that people will try to use to stop you from being able to go off, specifically stuff like Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void. I played this deck yesterday at F&M in this exact configuration, and there were multiple times that having access to Haywire Might was just a game saver because my opponent put something like Leyline into Void or Rest in Peace into play, and I didn't have access to my graveyard, so I couldn't combo off the normal ways, and I was able to just chord for Haywire Might, get rid of that thing, and then go off after that. So Haywire Might has been a great addition, and cheaper creatures like that that have extra utility become even more useful when you have Chord of Calling, because you can find them easily because you don't have access to a ton of mana. The more Chord of Collins you run, I think the more Wall of Roots you want to run, because Wall of Roots counts as 2 mana toward Chord every time, because you can both use its ability to add a mana by adding the counter, and you can tap it for Convoke. So that is another reason why Wall of Roots becomes especially great in a single turn cycle. And when I say turn cycle, I mean one of my turns, one of my opponent's turns. Wall of Roots can add 2 mana because you can do this ability on each turn. So that's really cool. So that is one other point where you'll see a little bit of tension back and forth is people choosing what tutors to have in. I think 6 is a good number in total, and I like the even split. Some people will want to run, and I have done this myself in the past, want to run 4 Green Sun Zenith because it maximizes your ability to have a turn 1 mana dork in play, because you've got your 4 delighted halflings, and then each copy of a Green Sun Zenith represents your Dryad Arbor. But because Green Sun Zenith shuffles itself back into your library when you use it, once you've played one, there are still 3 left in your deck. So it's kind of like you're playing 4, because you're going to find it again to be the next tutor. Okay, so that's another aspect we're going to talk about. Obviously, you're going to play 4 Yawgmoths. If you're playing the deck called the Yawgmoth, you're playing 4 Yawgmoths. There are some versions of like the Samwise combo deck that have shoved 1 Yawgmoth in there. That's not playing Yawgmoth, that's playing Samwise with a Yawgmoth in it. If you're playing this version of the deck, there's 4 of this guy, so that's just there. Very commonly, I'm on 2 Grist right now. Grist is a good card, but it is also clunky. Grist is not great when you're behind, unless you have some amount of board. But you want to have stuff to be able to sacrifice to use Grist really well. The thing that makes Grist really powerful in Yawgmoth is it is the best deck at having stuff in play that you want to sacrifice, and you get benefits out of sacrificing. Where if you're just trying to play Grist in like a Jund style deck, it's not very good at that, because most creatures you play in Modern are like, no, like I want the thing I invested for what it does, where like I can just have a Yawgmoth in play, or there are a lot of times you'll play it on turn 2 and you sack the Dryad Arbor you use to cast it because it does that. And then any amount of 1/1s that you get to make with Grist is really just a benefit, and Grist is really great under Soul Cauldron, which is true of much of this deck. You might be able to argue that this deck is as much an Agatha's Soul Cauldron deck as it is a Yawgmoth deck. They are both very powerful cards that enable a lot of cool things, but I don't think the deck would exist without Yawgmoth, and so anyway, it's Yawgmoth. But Soul Cauldron is a huge part of it. Once again, if you want to know all of the ins and outs, check out my deck tech video that I did earlier this year. Even though it's not all the cards are the same, most of the combos and everything are still relevant. Okay. Excuse me again. Sorry. There's one card choice right now that I'm a little iffy on before I get to Sephiroth. I'm going to talk about this one. And that is right now I have a Hapatra Vizier of Poisons in the deck. I see a lot of people like running this online, and I almost never run into a game where it's the card I want to get or that I feel like it would be useful, and it is almost always the first card I sideboard out. I think if you're playing against a bunch of like Boros Energy or decks like that, it's probably fantastic. But I don't run into that much of it, and you can fight those decks in a couple of other ways as well. This is the card that I'm considering cutting and putting in something else. I just don't know what else I'd want to put in. My first thought would be an Orcish Bowmaster, but I already don't have a ton of quality Green Sun Zenith targets outside of just going to get the Dryad Arbor. So I like having one more because you have these tutors, so that makes the tutors more powerful. And for something I'm going to talk about in a little bit, I also like having as many green cards in the deck as I possibly can. So I don't know exactly what I might play, but this is the card that I would be my first cut out of the deck, is Hapatra. I don't think it's a terrible inclusion or anything. I just find that I don't get much utility out of it, so it might not stay in the list. But I certainly know there are good reasons to play it. I just find it's not very impactful most of the time. So, the new addition to the deck is this card, Sephiroth Fabled Soldier. You'll see that I'm running 2 that is very uncommon. Okay, most of the time, if somebody's running this card, they are running one of them in this deck. I think there are other decks that might choose to run all 4. I like having two because I find that it makes games so much simpler and so much easier to win when you can find one of these. Like once you're comboing off with Yawgmoth, or even just as you're trying to get ahead in the game, this card is really good, and more so than any other Blood Artist style card that we have ever had access to. Blood Artist as a card, whether it's Blood Artist itself or any of the other variants you can play, they're a bad card. Like, let's just be honest. It's not a card you ever want to draw. You had one in your deck because it was the easiest way to win. But then we got to a point, and especially Dredger's Insight, where most people were cutting that slot out of the deck and saying, I'm just going to win in other ways. Then Sephiroth came out, and Sephiroth is by far the best Blood Artist we've ever seen. If you're not familiar with Sephiroth, what he says is he's a 2 mana, 2 and a black for a 3/3. It says whenever he enters or attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. Hey, we're already good at doing that, so we already are set up to have good stuff to sacrifice. Okay, so you can sacrifice another creature. If you do, draw a card. That's fantastic in and of itself, just being able to, like, my Blood Artist, my win con card that I go search up when I'm ready to do stuff, also now has another mode, or when it's like, when I have found all my pieces, it's still a good card. 3/3 is a solid body. It's especially in this deck, it's the biggest body we have, pretty much, besides Endurance. And it's going to draw me cards, and then it also has basically the Blood Artist effect. There's one key difference. Sephiroth says whenever his second ability, whenever another creature dies, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So that's what Blood Artist says. The only difference is Blood Artist will count itself. Sephiroth on this side of the card, it's a flip card, will not count itself if it dies. So if Sephiroth dies, you do not get the 1 life exchange. Okay? Other cards have to die. The rest of the ability says, if this is the 4th time this ability has resolved this turn, transform Sephiroth. And he turns into a 5/5 flyer that gives you an emblem that has the exact text of Blood Artist. Whenever a creature dies, which would include this one, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So when you've got the emblem out, it will then see if Sephiroth dies, you do get the effect. Okay? And then whenever the backside attacks, you may sacrifice any number of other creatures. If you do, draw that many cards, so you can also refill your hand. So this is another way, if you don't have Yawgmoth going, and you're somehow able to flip this, which is difficult but doable, this is the way to keep on digging. It's now a 5/5 flyer. That's really hard to deal with. Okay, so this functions in the same way that Blood Artist used to, but you now have the ability to have it be an actual good card. There's a lot of times if I can play this on turn 2 because I played a Mana Dork on turn 1, I'll just slam it, sack the Mana Dork, draw a card. Now I have a 3/3 in play that my opponent has to deal with. And sometimes it just allows you to get into some extra damage, and then you don't have to do as much comboing things in order to actually kill your opponent. So it makes the game so much easier. Playing 2 of them means you're going to find it more often, and then even if somehow like you mill it over and you didn't want it with like a rumble earlier in the game, you can still find it when you need it. I think it's a good enough card that to me it's worth playing 2, and I really don't mind at all. So there's that. The other card choice that I put in that some people don't is the number of Endurance I play main deck. Many people play 1, I play 2. The reason being is I still like the Endurance loops as a way to win. I'm not sure if part of the difference is that many of the lists you will see are people playing online, and going through the Endurance loops online is a very tedious process because you cannot shortcut any of it, and one click incorrect in executing the loops, which I'll show you in a second how to do that. One misclick within the loops ends up being really quite bad for you, because then you've messed up the thing, you can't keep going. So I don't know if that's simply a concession to online play as to why there's often only one of these. I play 2 because that allows you to do the loops that mean a lot of times you get to a point where you're like, okay, I can do Yawgmoth, draw a bunch of cards things, but I don't have anything else to do with it. Running 2 Endurance allows you to do that. Okay. So that's most of the deck. I'll talk about the sideboard here briefly. There's nothing too crazy in the sideboard, pretty simple stuff. But I think I hit on all of what I think are the interesting card choices. You can play around with numbers a little bit. I only run 3 Soul Cauldron instead of 4, mostly because I have to put in extra endurance, and because I'm playing 2 Sephiroth, I'm a little bit more leaning on the classic Yawgmoth combo kill to win rather than the Soul Cauldron stuff. A lot of people will have 4 Soul Cauldron, only 1 Blood Artist effect, only 1 endurance, and so you can go from there. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the endurance loops that I mentioned. Okay, I talk about some of this in that other deck tech video, but I'm going to go through it again here because there is a little bit of a wrinkle now that you're running Sephiroth. So, what that involves is using your endurances in order to, once you've got Yawgmoth set up to draw your deck, to actually be able to win the game without giving your opponent any more chances to take actions. Alright, so I've got this set up here. The main idea of these loops is that once you've gotten to a point, and you've got kind of a setup I've got here, where you've got an active Yawgmoth and the ability to not worry about your life total. So generally that setup is going to be you've got 2 Young Wolves, a Prosperous Innkeeper, and a Yawgmoth in play. At minimum, it can just be that. We'll talk about why you need this here in a second. But the idea is that once you've got to this point, but in this case, I have no untapped lands. I can't play any more cards from my hand, but I want to be able to win the game right now. I've established this thing where I can draw as many cards as I want out of my deck. I should be able to win. And this is why I like including both endurances, because, hey, that's the thing that you need. So I set these cards aside because these are the important cards for what we're doing here. You will need 1 Chord of Calling. You'll need access to 1 of your Blood Artist effects. So I'm just going to start saying Sephiroth because I think there's no reason to play any of the other ones. So I need a Chord of Calling, I need a Sephiroth, and I need 2 endurances. That is what you will eventually have in hand. Okay. So before you start this process, you need to have access to a 1-drop, whether that is in play or in your graveyard. It could also be Dryad Arbor. So it doesn't matter if it is a Young Wolf in your graveyard, a Delighted Halfling, or Dryad Arbor, or even Haywire Might. You just need access to a 1-mana card. Okay? So often it'll be in play, very likely tapped for you to have gotten to this scenario. Okay? And so what you're going to do is you're going to execute a rather complicated series of loops throughout your deck in order to win the game. Okay? And this is, say, where we're in the middle of my turn. I've just managed to get my Yawgmoth in play. I'm now going to be able to say, I can win the game from here. If, for instance, you don't have access to this 1-drop, okay, you'll need to do this a little bit more slowly than I'm going to generally do, because you're going to have to be able to find it. So the hope is that you find a Chord of Calling before you draw your last 1-drop or Dryad Arbor in your deck, which is very likely. Okay, you may have cast a Malevolent Rumble at some point and there's something in here. Somebody may have killed a Delighted Halfling, whatever. You need access to 1. So I'm just going to say I have it in play right now. So the idea with this setup is that I can loop these Young Wolves, basically just by using Yawgmoth's ability to put a -1/-1 counter one, sack the other. One comes back with Undyne, the other one loses a +1/+1 counter. That's the most basic Yawgmoth loop that exists, so hopefully you know it by this point. So I'm always going to leave a counter on one of them just to represent that they're in that state. At this point, because every time I do this, I use the Yawgmoth's ability, one of my Young Wolves is going to enter the battlefield from the graveyard. I'm going to offset the life loss from Yawgmoth's ability with Prosperous Innkeeper. So my life total will essentially stay the same as long as I'm not at 1 life. You cannot start this if you're at 1 life, because you'll pay the 1 life and die. So just make sure you don't try to start this at 1 life. Any other life total is perfectly fine. So what I'm going to do is I am now at a state where I can draw my entire deck. Okay? So in general, you might be able to get to a point where you've done this like, you can do the first iteration of casting these endurances the way I'm going to show you without drawing your whole deck, but after that you'll have to draw your whole deck. So generally when I'm going through it, I just say I'm going to draw my whole deck. And so what I'm going to do, so let's say that's everything. I have no cards in hand. This is everything that I have. I will get to this point, and as long as my opponent understands this interaction that I can draw, if not, you have to explain it and walk it through them 1 or 2 times. But I'm going to say what you're going to do is you're going to draw your whole deck except for 1 card. So your deck becomes your hand. I've got those 4 cards that I set aside. I'm going to leave them set aside, and I often do this face up when I'm going through these loops because I think it makes it a lot easier, and unless somehow your opponent has the right interaction, you're just showing them so that they understand that, like, what is happening, not necessarily that you have to walk through step by step to do it. So I will often just be like, okay, I'll set these cards aside and be like, I have these, I'm going to work with all this stuff, and I just sit with my deck here. Okay. The other thing I like to do is at this point, you can separate all of the green cards from the rest of your hand because you'll need them. So I separate all the green ones because those are the ones that matter. Remember, Dryad Arbor counts as a green card, so it works for this. So sometimes I'll literally sit and do this and it's like, okay, here's the way it's going to work, opponent, is I'm going to go through this stuff. So what you need to do in this first time through this loop is you need to be able to sacrifice this Delighted Halfling, this 1-drop, get it into your yard. If you already have one in your yard, you can bypass the having to sacrifice it step. Okay. The end goal of these loops is to get enough mana in play via treasures from Prosperous Innkeeper to cast your Sephiroth. Okay, which means I need access to 3 mana, so I'm going to have my Prosperous Innkeeper enter 3 different times. All right. So what I have to do is you're going to be using Endurances and Court of Calling in order to do that by shuffling what's in your graveyard into your library, Court of Calling it out, and then shuffle the Endurances back in, redraw them. And so you're going to be using these cards over and over again. All right. So the idea that I have here, and I'm going to move stuff a little bit so you can a little bit more clearly see what's in my hand versus what's not, is the first step of the loop is you have to get untapped creatures that you're going to need to be able to chord. So in order to chord for Prosperous Innkeeper, you have to be able to tap 5 total creatures. Well, the way these loops are going to work, and you'll see it in a second, you always have 4. You have 2 Young Wolves that will untap themselves via the drawing cards with Yawgmoth's ability, and you'll have 2 Endurances you can use. So you need 1 extra one. I see I have an untapped Yawgmoth here. That's 1. I'll need to be able to get it 2 more times with the Delighted Halfling is what I'm going to do here. So the reason why I say I'm going to draw every card but the last one in my deck is because the last sacrifice will not be one of my Young Wolves. It will be the card that I'm going to chord for. So the first time through the loop, I'm going to do my 1-drop. Once again, if you already have a 1-drop in your graveyard, you don't have to do this step this time. You could actually get rid of something else, okay? So I'm going to say, okay, for the last activation of Yawgmoth, before I run out of cards, I'm going to sacrifice the Halfling. I'm going to draw that last card. Okay, so now I have no cards in library. My 1-drop is in the graveyard. So what I do is I'm going to evoke cast both Endurances. So I will be exiling 2 green cards from my hand. That's why I separated all the green cards, because I'm going to be exiling a bunch of them with the evoke cast of the Endurances. The way you stack these triggers is the last thing that's going to resolve is one of the shuffles. Then you're going to have a sacrifice, and a shuffle. So the first thing you do is you shuffle what is ever in your graveyard to the bottom of your library. In this case, just for showing you, I'm using only 1 card. It'll often be more than 1. But at some point in these loops, you will end up in the state I am, where everything that's not in exile is either in play or in your hand. Okay, so I do the first shuffle. The Delighted Halfling becomes my library. Before I sacrifice anything, I still hold priority, and I'm going to use Court of Calling, Convoking, to get that 1-drop back. So I chord for X is 1. I search my library for a 1-drop, put this into play. It's now untapped. Court of Calling resolves. The first sacrifice of an Endurance resolves. The second sacrifice resolves. Then I shuffle these, and they go on the bottom of my library, essentially becoming my library. So what I do now is I'm going to draw 2 cards with Yawgmoth, which will reset my young wolves. They will come back. I've drawn these 2 cards again. Now I'm in a state where I'm ready to do this loop, but to get Prosperous Innkeeper. Okay, so my last sacrifice will not be the Delighted Halfling this time. It will be Prosperous Innkeeper. So I sacrifice Prosperous Innkeeper, draw the 3rd card that I need. And now we're back to the same state where what I will do is I'll evoke cast both Endurances. I'm going to exile 2 more cards from my library. Okay, then same orders. Shuffle, sack, sack, shuffle. So I'll shuffle first. Prosperous Innkeeper becomes my library. Before the sacrifices resolve, I'm going to tap 5 creatures to chord for X's 2. I chord for X's 2, Prosperous Innkeeper enters, then I make a treasure token. Okay. Chord resolves, sacrifice, sacrifice, shuffle. That's my library. Well, I need to do it another time because I don't have 3 treasures. Remember, Sephiroth costs 3. So I'm going to draw 2 cards to reset my young wolves. And then I'm going to say, all right, I need to do this again. I have to get another untapped creature. I'm going to use Yawgmoth the last time. So one shortcut you can do is for every extra untapped creature you have beyond the 2 young wolves, as long as Prosperous Innkeeper doesn't count because you can't convoke it when you're trying to get it because it will be in your deck. But for every extra untapped creature, you have to do this loop of getting your 1-drop back 1 less time. So if you happen to have another untapped creature at this point, you could just get rid of that 1 untapped creature, or not get rid of it. You could get rid of the Prosperous Innkeeper again and do it again. Okay, I could do the Prosperous Innkeeper loop again right now because I have Yawgmoth. I'll have to do this 1 more time no matter what. So I'm just going to do it now. So for the last one, I'm going to sacrifice the Delighted Halfling. We've seen this before. Draw the last card. Evoke cast both Endurances. Halfling becomes my library. Chord of Calling X is 1. Halfling enters, resolves, resolves. These become my library. You're starting to see the way the loop works. Okay, so now I'm going to draw 2, reset my young wolves. I'm ready to do the Prosperous Innkeeper again. Evoke cast. See where this gets complicated. People struggle to understand what you're doing here. So shuffle that in. Chord of Calling. Make a 2nd treasure token. Now I have 2 mana. Remember, I need 3. Sephiroth costs 3. Okay. You also, if you had like something untapped that could produce mana at this point, like a spawn token, you could end the loop here because you have 3. You don't have to do this 1 more time. I have to do it 1 more time because I showed you the most basic minimalist setup possible. All right. Chord of Calling resolves. Sacks resolve. These shuffle. Now, because I have Yawgmoth untapped, I can still chord for X's 5 with this last creature, so I don't have to loop in my Halfling 1 more time. So I'm just going to do the Prosperous Innkeeper 3rd time. So I draw 2 with Young Wolf, with the Young Wolf loops. Then I will sacrifice the Prosperous Innkeeper as the last one. Get back the other Endurance. Well, we're going to do this 1 more time, where I cast both Endurances by evoking them. Shuffle this in. Chord for X's 2. Get Prosperous Innkeeper for the 3rd time. Now this has to be at your... this has to be in one of your main phases when you can cast a creature, but most of the time this will be... it's a little bit harder to do if you have to do it in instant speed. Okay, so these resolve. Same thing we've seen. So now I'm here. I now have 3 treasures. So the first thing I'll do is I'll sacrifice all 3 treasures for mana, and I will cast Sephiroth. Now, if you have an extra creature like the Delighted Halfling, if you want, you can use Sephiroth's ability right now when he enters to sacrifice a creature, draw a card. You don't have to. You can just bypass it. You can say, no, I'm good. I choose not to sacrifice a creature. The main thing is you do not want to sacrifice this Young Wolf that doesn't have a +1/+1 counter, because then it's much harder to loop them. You have to sacrifice something else. And for where you are right now, you need everything that is not this Delighted Halfling. So if you have this extra creature and you want to, you can. You do not have to. You will still get the damage from it later. Okay? So now we're at the point where I'm also going to start counting up the damage, because people are like, well, how many green cards do you have? Like, you just used a whole bunch of them in order to get to this point where Sephiroth's in play. And yes, I did. But you can still deal quite a bit of damage. Okay. So now I'm done having to do these loops to get creatures into play. And so now I'm just trying to maximize how much damage I can do with Sephiroth, which counts every time a creature other than he dies. So when I draw 2 cards with the Young Wolves, that's 2 creatures dying. I've dealt 2 damage. Okay. So I've drawn 2 cards. What I don't need to do anymore is worry about Court of Calling. So I can just put it in my stack of green cards. Obviously, if your opponent interacts with you in some of these phases, you have to adapt. So it's not always free and clear to go if they're representing mana, but this is how you do this loop, which I find is a way I win a fair number of games. Okay. So now, instead of having to now sacrifice a different creature to the last activation of Yawgmoth, I can just keep on doing the Young Wolf thing. So I've drawn 3 cards. All right. So I'm going to evoke cast those Endurances again. There's nothing in my graveyard to shuffle in, so then these both get sacrificed due to evoke. That means they died. I trigger Sephiroth 2 more times. They then shuffle back in. I'm going to draw them again. And that's 7. Well, then I'm going to pitch cast them again. And then they die. 9 damage. Shuffle them in. Draw. That's 11. Pitch cast. They die. 13. Shuffle them in. Draw. 15. So essentially what you're seeing is for every 2 green cards you have in your hand, you're dealing 4 damage. Pitch cast. They sacrifice. Go up to 17. Shuffle. Draw. 19. Pitch cast. They die. I go to 21. Damage dealt. They shuffle in. I draw. I go to 20. I go to 23. I've got 2 more in my hand. So 25. I draw. 27. You're not done yet. Now I have 2 green cards. I can pitch cast 1 Endurance, exiling the other. So now I hit 28 damage. This one comes in. I can draw it. I'm at 29. Now I have no more green cards left. If you look at the rest of my hand, which is the rest of my deck, I've used every single other green card that I have access to. Okay, but we're still not done with the damage that we can deal. And so here's why. There is a rules interaction that is kind of buried in the way that is not always intuitive to people. In Magic, when you cast spells or activate abilities, you declare the casting or activation of the spell or ability. Then you pick targets, then you determine costs, then you pay costs. So the way Yawgmoth reads, it says pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature. That is the cost. The effect of the ability is put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card. Per the rules of Magic, if the only legal targets for a spell or ability are no longer legal when that spell or ability goes to resolve, it does not happen. The effects of it do not happen. It's what we call fizzling. So with Yawgmoth's ability, what you can do, and I want you to get in the habit if you're playing this deck of activating it and announcing it this way, is I say, I'm going to activate Yawgmoth's ability, and then you declare your target, and then as the cost, say, I'm going to sacrifice this, and you do that. So you've paid a life, you've done that, you've declared the target. What that means you can do is you can target a creature and sacrifice that creature as the cost of the ability and forcing the ability to fizzle. Because you notice I have no cards left in my library. So if I draw a card, I would lose the game. So what I can do is I can say, activate Yawgmoth, target Delighted Halfling, and then I'm going to pay the costs of I pay a life and I sacrifice the creature that I've targeted. So now the ability goes to resolve because I can't do the ability until I've paid the cost of the ability. The ability sees that the target is no longer a valid target, and so it doesn't resolve. It can't put a -1/-1 counter. I don't draw a card, but a creature still died. This might be an interaction with a lot of players that they will then call a judge. And hopefully the judge understands the rules correctly. This is absolutely the way this works. Okay? So then I can just do that to basically the rest of my board. Remember, at this point, Sephiroth will have turned into the backside, and so you'll have the emblem. So even when this thing dies, you'll do a damage. So I can sacrifice the Young Wolf without a +1/+1 counter, and it'll come back. and I've dealt an 11th damage. So then I say activate, target, sacrifice. The ability fizzles, but a creature still died. Activate, target, sacrifice, trigger. So I'm up to 13. I can do 14, and I can do 15. So in this case, with the number of green cards I have in my deck, and the number of times I had to execute the loop simply to get the Sephiroth into play, I was still able to deal 35 damage through this loop. Most games, that will be enough to kill your opponent. So, that is how you execute the rather complicated endurance loops, and even though they're complicated and you don't need it that often, I like to have it in my deck because it gives me that out to be able to play to, where I don't give my opponent the chance to be able to do anything once I've established this combo state. Okay, I played 4 matches of this with this deck yesterday at F&M. I did this once. It was actually in the Yawgmoth mirror, which was interesting, but it doesn't come up all that many times, but it does come up enough that I like the inclusion. You don't have to include it if you don't want to, but if you want to, that's how you execute it. Okay, it is something that you will have to be fluent in doing yourself, and you will have to be able to explain what is happening well. So practice it and practice it and practice it, because if you don't explain it well, you're fumbling through it, you're one likely to make a mistake and it won't work, or your opponent will not understand what you're doing and think you're doing it wrong, and a lot of people will not fully understand how this works, especially that last bit where you can declare your own creature as the target for an ability and sacrifice it as the cost, forcing the ability to fizzle. Okay, but so that's how that works. That's a complicated thing. Otherwise, it's just knowing a lot of the other loops, and there you go. Most games with this setup, you win simply because you got a Sephiroth into play and you have the ability to sacrifice creatures at will, and then you offset the life loss from Yawgmoth, and then your opponent just dies. So, last thing we'll talk about briefly is not the tokens. This deck uses a lot of tokens. There's a whole lot of things you make in this deck. So if you like tokens, it's a cool deck. Let's talk briefly about the sideboard. There's not a whole lot of interesting to talk about. 3 Fatal Push, 3 Thoughtseize. I run 1 Abrupt Decay, 1 Scavenging Ooze, 3 Fulminator Mage, 1 Reclamation Sage, which is not as common, but I really like it. The reason why I like Reclamation Sage over something like Outland Liberator is this doesn't require the activation of ability, so when things like, I don't know, Clarion Conqueror are in play, your Rec Sage can still destroy an artifact or an enchantment. Force of Vigor, Culling Ritual, and Skyfisher Spider. So you've got a few different categories that I like to think of. You've got some extra removal for just generic removal of stuff that pushes the Decay and the Skyfisher Spider. The Decay and the Skyfisher Spider are nice because they also function the way that like the Reclamation Sage or the Force of Vigor does, in terms of like counter hate. So people are going to bring in stuff to hate out your graveyard, so you can't execute the loops with the Young Wolves because Undying won't work if they get exiled instead. These things all allow you to kind of fight through those. So these cards do double duty as removal and counter hate. So I really like having those in. Scavenging Ooze is fantastic in this deck. There are a lot of your own creatures to eat. He gets big. It puts +1/+1 counters on him, so then he has access to everything that's in Soul Cauldron. Even though you don't see this card much in Modern anymore, I think this is a deck where it still shines, which is really cool to me because, one, it's a cool card, and I like the idea that there are still ways for old cards that maybe aren't as powerful the way they used to be to still see play. Thoughtseize just for all kinds of stuff, for against other combo decks, for against trying to counter the hate if you've got space for it. Just Thoughtseize is like, hey, I need to fight through stuff. I want to take it out before you get to do it. Fulminator Mage is pretty self-explanatory, fights the big mana decks, especially Eldrazi. And because this is an activated ability, if you put a Fulminator Mage underneath the Cauldron, every creature you have can become a Fulminator Mage, and you can just shut your Eldrazi opponent out of mana and then just win the game after that. Culling Ritual is a really cool card. It is a board wipe. It says destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. Add black or green for each permanent destroyed this way. I love this card against Boros Energy. Also against like any of the like affinity adjacent builds of stuff. because they've got a bunch of like 0 manas and little artifacts and tokens, and so you can really swing the game in your favor with this card. So, like I said, I don't think anything crazy in the sideboard. Pretty self-explanatory. You can shift around numbers as you want to counter whatever you feel like countering. But that's my updated version of Yawgmoth post the Final Fantasy release. I guess this is also technically post Edge of Eternities, but I don't think anything in Edge of Eternities really changed what I'm running. So those are just my most recent updates and thoughts as to what I'm thinking for the deck. So hopefully also that extra run through of the endurance loops helps make it at least clearer, or maybe convinces you that you should play it too. But hopefully you enjoy. If you've got any other questions about the deck or how to run through stuff, leave them for me and I'll see if I can answer them. I'm not saying I'm an expert in the deck by any means, but I do enjoy playing the deck and I think it's really interesting. So enjoy, and until next time, we'll see you.